Washington, D.C., early 1960s. The Cold War was at its most tense. Across the street from the Soviet embassy, American intelligence officers watched every movement of Soviet diplomats. Conversations on park benches, quiet meetings in cars, casual walks that might hide secrets about missiles, nuclear plans, or spies. The problem was simple. They couldn't hear what was being said. Placing microphones was risky. Bugs were often discovered. Human agents attracted suspicion. Surveillance teams could follow, but not listen. Inside the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, analysts and engineers were asked a strange question. What if the perfect spy was already walking the streets? Not a person, not a device, a cat. Cats wandered everywhere in Washington. They sat near benches, slipped through fences, and nobody paid them attention. To intelligence planners, the idea began to sound almost perfect. If a microphone could be hidden inside the animal, and a transmitter placed under its skin, a cat could sit beside two diplomats discussing classified information, and no one would suspect a thing. The program was given a code name, Acoustic Kitty. Over the next several years, the CIA would spend an estimated $20 million trying to turn an ordinary house cat into a living surveillance device. Engineers, veterinarians, and intelligence officers worked together in one of the strangest espionage experiments of the Cold War. It sounded brilliant in theory. In practice, it would become one of the most bizarre and disastrous operations in intelligence history. Because when the first mission finally began on the streets of Washington, the CIA's brand new spy didn't even survive the first few minutes. By the early 1960s, the world was living in the shadow of nuclear war. Just 15 years after the end of World War II, two superpowers had emerged as rivals for global dominance: the United States and the Soviet Union. Their armies rarely faced each other directly, but behind the scenes they fought an invisible conflict of intelligence, espionage, and technological innovation. It was the era historians would later call the Cold War. In this conflict, information was as valuable as weapons. A single conversation overheard in the right place could reveal plans about nuclear missiles, troop movements, or covert operations. Governments built enormous intelligence networks to collect these secrets. At the center of America's effort was the Central Intelligence Agency. Founded in 1947, the CIA had grown rapidly during the 1950s. By the time President John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, the agency had become one of the most powerful intelligence organizations in the world. Thousands of analysts, field officers, engineers, and scientists worked behind closed doors trying to understand and outmaneuver the Soviet Union. But spying on Soviet officials inside the United States was far from easy. Diplomats working at the Soviet embassy in Washington or the Soviet mission to the United Nations in New York were carefully trained in counter-surveillance techniques. Many had backgrounds in the Soviet intelligence service, the feared KGB. They assumed they were being watched at all times, and often they were. American surveillance teams followed Soviet officials through city streets, into restaurants, and sometimes even onto public transportation. But following someone only revealed where they went. It did not reveal what they said. That was the real challenge. Most important conversations took place outdoors, far from microphones or hidden recording devices. Soviet diplomats often met in parks, on sidewalks, or during casual walks around Washington. They knew that buildings could be bugged. Public spaces were safer. For the CIA, those quiet conversations were maddeningly close, but impossible to hear. During the 1950s and early 1960s, intelligence agencies around the world experimented with increasingly creative listening technologies. Tiny microphones were hidden inside furniture, telephones, lamps, and even walls. Miniature transmitters could broadcast conversations to receivers hundreds of meters away. But the technology had limits. Devices still needed to be placed somewhere close to the target. If a meeting happened on a park bench or on a quiet street corner, the CIA had few options. Agents could not simply walk up and install a bug in the middle of a public park. The agency's technical experts began to think about alternative solutions. One of the most secretive divisions inside the CIA at the time was the Office of Technical Services, often known simply as OTS. Engineers in this unit designed some of the agency's most unusual equipment: concealed cameras, miniature recording devices, disguised radios, and specialized surveillance tools. Their mission was simple: invent technology that made espionage possible. And in the strange atmosphere of Cold War competition, almost no idea was considered too unusual to explore. By the early 1960s, American intelligence planners believed the Soviet Union had made significant advances in spying technology. The fear that the United States might fall behind drove the CIA to invest heavily in experimental research. Some of these projects were practical, others were deeply strange. In other parts of the agency, scientists were experimenting with mind-control drugs under the program known as Project MK-Ultra. Researchers explored whether chemicals like LSD could be used to influence behavior or extract information from prisoners. Elsewhere, engineers tested miniature surveillance devices that could be hidden in clothing, cigarette packs, or everyday objects. But even among these unusual experiments, one idea stood out for its sheer oddity. The concept emerged during discussions among CIA engineers and intelligence officers who were frustrated by the same problem again and again: how to place a listening device close enough to overhear a conversation without being detected. If technology could not easily reach the target, perhaps something else could. Something that would not look suspicious. Something that could approach two people talking on a park bench and remain there without drawing attention. The answer, according to one group of CIA planners, was obvious: animals. Animals moved freely through public spaces. Birds landed on benches and railings. Dogs wandered through parks. Cats slipped through neighborhoods unnoticed. Unlike human agents, animals did not attract suspicion. Nobody would question a stray cat wandering through Washington, D.C. In fact, cats had a particular advantage. They often approached people out of curiosity, especially if food was nearby. A cat could easily settle down beside two individuals sitting on a bench and remain there long enough to capture a conversation. To intelligence planners, the idea seemed almost perfect. If engineers could hide a microphone inside the animal and a miniature transmitter somewhere in its body, the animal itself could become a mobile surveillance device. Of course, the concept sounded bizarre, but Cold War espionage was already full of strange ideas that had become real projects. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain experimented with everything from concealed cameras and coat buttons to poison-tipped umbrellas. Compared to those inventions, turning an animal into a listening device did not seem completely impossible. The proposal began to circulate quietly within the CIA's technical divisions. Engineers and veterinarians were consulted about whether such a system could actually work. The technology itself was beginning to exist. Microphones were becoming smaller. Radio transmitters were shrinking. Battery technology was improving. If the components could be miniaturized enough, they might fit inside a small animal. The biggest challenge would not be the electronics. It would be the animal itself. Unlike machines, animals could not be programmed. They could not be easily controlled once released. A surveillance device hidden inside a cat would be useless if the cat decided to run away, chase a bird, or simply wander off. Still, the idea fascinated intelligence planners. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, the potential reward seemed worth the risk. If the concept worked, it could provide an entirely new method of surveillance, one that foreign diplomats would never suspect. Some CIA officers initially laughed when they heard the proposal. Others were intrigued. Eventually, curiosity won. Sometime in the early 1960s, the CIA authorized a classified research project to explore whether the concept could be made real. The program received a code name that sounded almost playful compared to its secret purpose: Acoustic Kitty. What began as a strange idea inside the halls of the CIA was about to become one of the most unusual experiments in the history of espionage. And before it was over, the agency would spend years and millions of dollars trying to transform an ordinary house cat into a Cold War spy. Once the project received approval, the strange idea had to become a real operation. Inside the CIA's technical divisions, engineers began asking a practical question. Could a living animal actually carry surveillance equipment without being harmed, or without revealing the device? The project quickly moved beyond theory. Specialists from the CIA's technical laboratories began working with veterinarians and electronics engineers to design a system small enough to fit inside a cat's body. The goal was to create a fully functioning listening device that could record conversations and transmit them to agents nearby. At the time, surveillance technology was advancing rapidly. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, American intelligence agencies had invested heavily in miniature electronics. Transmitters and microphones were becoming smaller, lighter, and more efficient. Still, fitting them inside an animal was something entirely different. Engineers first had to design a microphone sensitive enough to capture human speech from several feet away. Conversations on a park bench could be quiet, especially if the speakers were trying not to be overheard. The microphone also had to survive inside a living body. After months of experimentation, technicians developed a small device that could be surgically implanted in the cat's ear canal. From there, it could pick up nearby sound without being visible from the outside. But capturing sound was only the first step. The signal needed to be transmitted to CIA surveillance teams positioned nearby. For that, engineers developed a miniature radio transmitter that could be hidden under the animal's skin. The transmitter required power. This created another problem. Early surveillance devices depended on batteries that were often bulky and short-lived. Engineers had to design a battery system small enough to remain concealed while still providing enough power for the transmitter to operate during a mission. Eventually, they placed the battery inside the animal's chest cavity. Another component was needed as well: an antenna. Without an antenna, the radio transmitter could not send the signal to the receiving equipment used by CIA agents. Engineers came up with a solution that sounded almost surreal. The antenna would run through the cat's body and extend along its tail. With careful surgical placement, the tail itself could function as a natural antenna, transmitting the signal outward without attracting attention. By the time the prototype was complete, the cat had effectively become a biological surveillance platform. Inside its body were several pieces of miniature electronics: a microphone in the ear, a radio transmitter under the skin, a battery powering the system, an antenna running through the tail. From the outside, the animal appeared completely ordinary. But building the device was only half the challenge. The next problem was even harder: training the cat. Unlike dogs, which have been trained for military and police work for decades, cats are famously independent animals. They are difficult to control, difficult to direct, and often uninterested in following commands. For the CIA, this created a major obstacle. The plan required the cat to approach a specific location, such as a bench where two Soviet officials were sitting, and remain there long enough to capture their conversation. But cats rarely behave exactly as humans expect. To solve this problem, trainers attempted to condition the animal to move towards certain locations or remain near people for extended periods. The training process took months. Handlers experimented with food rewards, sound cues, and various forms of conditioning. They attempted to teach the cat to move toward a target and sit quietly nearby. Sometimes the training appeared promising. At other times, it seemed completely hopeless. According to later reports, one of the biggest problems was distraction. A passing bird, a sudden noise, or even the smell of food could cause the animal to abandon its training and run off in an unpredictable direction. The CIA nevertheless continued investing time and resources into the project. The agency had already committed significant funding, and the engineers were proud of the technology they had created. From a purely technical standpoint, the device itself was impressive. Few people outside the intelligence community understood how advanced Cold War surveillance research had become. In fact, the CIA was developing entire categories of miniature devices during this period. Some microphones were small enough to hide inside everyday objects. Others could be disguised inside clothing or carried by human agents without detection. But Acoustic Kitty represented something entirely different. It was not simply a device. It was a living platform for intelligence collection. The combination of biology and electronics made the project both innovative and unpredictable. Over the next several years, engineers continued refining the system. They worked to improve signal clarity and reduce interference. They experimented with ways to stabilize the electronics inside the animal's body so that movement would not disrupt the transmission. The training program also continued. Handlers tried to create scenarios that resembled real intelligence operations. The cat was guided toward specific locations where people were talking. Trainers rewarded the animal when it remained close enough for the microphone to capture voices. Slowly, progress seemed possible. But there was always a lingering concern inside the agency. Even if the technology worked, and even if the cat could be trained, would it behave correctly during a real mission? Espionage operations depend on precision. A human agent can adapt to unexpected situations. An electronic bug will continue recording until it is discovered. But a cat? A cat could decide to chase a squirrel, or wander down an alley, or simply ignore everything around it. Despite these doubts, the CIA leadership eventually decided that the experiment had gone far enough. The technology existed. The training was as complete as it was ever going to be. It was time to test Acoustic Kitty in the real world. A target location was chosen in Washington, D.C. Two Soviet officials were known to meet regularly in a public area not far from the Soviet embassy. Their conversations might contain valuable intelligence, and the setting, an open public space, made traditional surveillance difficult. For the CIA, it was the perfect opportunity. Agents prepared their equipment and positioned themselves nearby in a surveillance vehicle, ready to receive the transmitted signal. The cat, now equipped with its hidden electronics, was brought to the location. After years of planning, engineering, and training, the strangest spy in CIA history was finally ready for its first mission. All that remained was to release it and watch what happened next. The test operation took place on the streets of Washington, D.C., sometime in the mid-1960s. For the CIA, the location had been carefully chosen. Not far from the embassy of the Soviet Union in Washington, D.C., Soviet officials were known to meet occasionally outside, sometimes sitting on benches, sometimes walking slowly along quiet streets where they believed they could speak freely. Outdoor meetings were common practice for intelligence officers during the Cold War. Buildings could be bugged. Offices could be monitored. Apartments could contain hidden microphones. But a casual conversation outside, especially in a public place, was far more difficult to intercept. That was exactly the kind of situation Acoustic Kitty had been designed for. CIA surveillance officers selected a location where two Soviet officials were expected to meet. The plan was simple in theory. Release the cat nearby and allow it to wander toward the men. Once the animal settled close enough, the hidden microphone would begin capturing their conversation. The signal would then be transmitted to CIA agents waiting nearby with specialized receiving equipment. Inside a surveillance van parked a short distance away, technicians prepared the monitoring system. Radio receivers were switched on. Recording equipment was tested. Engineers checked the signal frequencies connected to the transmitter hidden inside the animal. Years of development had led to this moment. According to later accounts, several CIA officers were present during the operation. Some were excited to see whether the experiment would work. Others remained skeptical. The technology itself had passed tests in controlled conditions. The electronics functioned. The signal could be received and recorded. But no one knew what would happen once the cat was released into a real environment. Finally, the moment arrived. The animal was taken out of the vehicle and placed near the sidewalk. From a distance, the scene looked completely ordinary. Washington was full of stray cats and wandering pets. Nothing about this animal would have appeared unusual to a passerby. Inside the surveillance van, agents waited. The cat began moving toward the direction where the two Soviet men were sitting. At first, everything seemed to be working exactly as planned. The technicians watching the equipment began receiving audio signals from the microphone. The transmitter was functioning. The system was alive. For a brief moment, it looked as though the CIA's strangest idea might actually succeed. But espionage operations often collapse in unexpected ways, and animals, unlike machines, cannot follow a script. As the cat approached the street, something happened that no one inside the surveillance van could control. The animal suddenly ran toward the road. Perhaps it was startled by a sound. Perhaps it saw movement. Perhaps it simply followed its natural instincts. Whatever the reason, the carefully planned operation instantly fell apart. A passing taxi struck the cat before the agents could react. Inside the van, the signal abruptly disappeared. Years of research, millions of dollars, and one of the most unusual experiments in intelligence history had ended in a matter of seconds. The first field test of Acoustic Kitty had failed almost immediately. For the officers involved, the moment must have been surreal. They had spent years attempting to solve the technical challenges of turning an animal into a surveillance platform. Engineers had designed miniature electronics that pushed the limits of Cold War technology. But in the end, the most sophisticated equipment in the world could not overcome a simple reality. Cats do whatever they want. Following the disastrous test, CIA leadership began reconsidering the entire program. Even if the electronics worked, and they did, the operational risks were enormous. Animals were unpredictable. They could not be trusted to behave consistently in complex environments filled with distractions. Unlike human agents or stationary surveillance devices, the cat could not be controlled once released. And in intelligence operations, control is everything. Soon after the failed mission, the agency quietly decided to shut down the project. Acoustic Kitty was officially abandoned. The equipment developed for the program would never be used again in this form. The idea of animal-based electronic surveillance, at least using cats, proved too impractical for real intelligence work. For decades afterward, the story remained hidden inside classified files. The public knew nothing about it. Even many people working in intelligence were unaware that the CIA had once attempted to turn a household pet into a spy. It would remain buried in secret archives for nearly 40 years, until a new law forced government agencies to reveal parts of their past. And when the documents finally surfaced, the world would discover that one of the strangest espionage projects of the Cold War had been completely real. After the failed field test, the program quietly disappeared. Inside the Central Intelligence Agency, projects were often terminated without public discussion. Intelligence agencies rarely announced their mistakes, and during the Cold War, almost everything connected to espionage remained classified. Acoustic Kitty was no exception. Reports about the experiment were filed away in internal documents, technical evaluations, and operational summaries. Engineers documented what had worked and what had not. Analysts explained why the program had proven impractical for real-world intelligence operations. The conclusion was clear. Even though the electronics themselves had been a technological success, The concept of using a cat as a surveillance platform was simply too unpredictable. Animals could not be controlled with the precision required for espionage work. Unlike machines, they followed instinct rather than instructions, and intelligence operations depended on reliability. The project was eventually marked as terminated, and attention inside the agency shifted to more practical surveillance technologies, smaller microphones, better transmitters, and increasingly sophisticated listening devices. For decades, the story remained hidden inside classified files. Outside the intelligence community, no one knew the project had ever existed. Even journalists who investigated Cold War espionage rarely heard rumors about it. Compared to famous intelligence programs, spy satellites, covert operations, and secret wars, the idea of turning a cat into a surveillance device seemed almost too strange to be believable. But history has a way of revealing secrets. In 1966, the United States passed an important law known as the Freedom of Information Act, often called FOIA. The law gave citizens the right to request previously classified government documents. Although many intelligence records remained secret for national security reasons, thousands of files would gradually be released over the following decades. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, historians and journalists began requesting documents related to Cold War intelligence experiments. Among the files released were internal CIA reports describing one of the agency's strangest technical projects. For the first time, the public saw references to Acoustic Kitty. The documents revealed that the CIA had indeed attempted to implant surveillance equipment inside a cat as part of an experimental listening program during the 1960s. The files described the technology, the surgical procedures, and the extensive training efforts designed to guide the animal toward specific targets. They also mentioned the enormous cost of the experiment. According to CIA estimates contained in the documents, the project had consumed roughly $20 million in funding during its development phase. Adjusted for inflation, that amount would equal well over $150 million today. For a project that ended after a single failed field test, the numbers seemed astonishing. When the story began circulating in newspapers and intelligence history books, many readers assumed it must be exaggerated. But the documents were real. Some of the files were published in a collection known as the CIA Family Jewels, a set of internal reports that described controversial or unusual activities conducted by the agency during the Cold War. The revelations fascinated the public. For decades, popular culture had portrayed intelligence agencies as masters of sophisticated technology and carefully planned covert operations. Acoustic Kitty suggested that even powerful organizations could sometimes pursue ideas that bordered on the absurd. Historians studying the documents pointed out that the program was not entirely irrational. Cold War espionage pushed intelligence agencies to explore unconventional ideas. Engineers constantly searched for new ways to place listening devices closer to their targets. Animals had occasionally been used in military operations before. During World War II, for example, both Allied and Axis forces experimented with using animals for specialized tasks. But combining biology and electronics at this level was something entirely new. And, as the documents revealed, the CIA engineers involved in the project had actually succeeded in solving many of the technical challenges. Miniature microphones had been successfully implanted. Transmitters had been developed small enough to hide inside the animal's body. The signal could be received by nearby monitoring equipment. From a technological perspective, the project had demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. The real failure had been operational, not technical. The intelligence officers involved had underestimated one simple truth about cats: they cannot be controlled. Once the story became public, it quickly spread through books, documentaries, and articles about unusual Cold War experiments. Acoustic Kitty joined a long list of strange intelligence projects revealed through declassified documents. Programs exploring mind-controlled drugs, psychological warfare techniques, and unconventional surveillance tools were suddenly visible to historians and the public alike. For many readers, the story felt almost like satire, but it was also a reminder of how intense the Cold War had been. Governments on both sides believed the future of the world might depend on intelligence advantages. In that environment, ideas that seemed ridiculous under normal circumstances were sometimes taken seriously. The search for better surveillance methods pushed engineers and intelligence officers to test the limits of science, technology, and imagination. Sometimes those experiments produced revolutionary tools, and sometimes they produced stories like Acoustic Kitty, one of the strangest chapters in the history of espionage. Looking back today, the story of Acoustic Kitty almost sounds like a joke. An intelligence agency spending millions of dollars to turn a household pet into a spy seems more like a scene from a comedy than a real Cold War operation. But the documents show that the experiment was very real, and the people involved took it seriously. In the tense atmosphere of the 1960s, the world was divided between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both sides believed that information could determine the outcome of the global struggle. A single overheard conversation might reveal military plans, political strategies, or the identity of a spy. That pressure drove intelligence agencies to pursue ideas that pushed the limits of technology, and sometimes common sense. Inside the Central Intelligence Agency, engineers were encouraged to experiment. Their mission was to develop tools that could give American intelligence even the smallest advantage over its rival. Most of those experiments never became public. Some led to breakthroughs in surveillance technology that shaped modern intelligence work. Miniature microphones, hidden transmitters, and sophisticated listening devices all emerged from Cold War research. But others, like Acoustic Kitty, revealed the strange side of espionage. The engineers involved in the project had actually solved many complex problems. They managed to miniaturize electronic equipment at a time when such technology was still in its early stages. They designed a system that could transmit audio signals from a moving animal to surveillance agents nearby. From a technical perspective, the achievement was remarkable. The real flaw was not the technology. It was the assumption that an animal could be turned into a reliable intelligence tool. Cats are independent, curious, and unpredictable. No amount of engineering could change that basic reality. When the CIA attempted its first real mission, the operation collapsed almost instantly. Years of development ended in a moment that intelligence officers could neither predict nor control. Yet the story also reveals something important about the Cold War. It was an era when governments believed that every advantage mattered. Intelligence agencies competed not only through spies and covert operations, but also through scientific experimentation. Sometimes those experiments produced revolutionary technologies, and sometimes they produced ideas that, decades later, seem almost unbelievable. Acoustic Kitty became one of the most famous examples of the strange world hidden behind classified intelligence programs. When the documents were finally released under the Freedom of Information Act, the public discovered that even the most powerful intelligence organizations could pursue ideas that sounded like fiction. In the end, the project failed, but it left behind a story that perfectly captures the atmosphere of the Cold War, an era of intense fear, rapid technological change, and a willingness to explore almost any possibility in the search for an advantage. Because in the secret world of espionage, the line between genius and absurdity has always been very thin. And sometimes, that line runs straight through the tail of a cat.